So as I was saying, Paul is the man of the city world, and he goes west and doesn't bother with the village world, the rustic village world of Palestine and Eastern Christianity. And the eastern side of the Magian civilization is the side that's more authentic and that's further away from the pseudomorphosis. But Paul goes to the cities, to the cities of the Greeks, and proselytizes, goes to Rome, goes to that whole world, and it's largely to him and his urban intellect that we owe the formulation of Christianity as an urban phenomenon, which slowly begins to penetrate Rome and lays the basis for the Catholic Church. And he writes his epistles in Greek, and it's as a result of that that all the rest of the writings of the Gospels are also written in Greek. The Mark Gospel is the oldest of the four Gospels, and Spengler says that the Mark Gospel is fundamentally a creative act of a great individual. It's written in Greek, not Aramaic, even though everyone was speaking Aramaic in the Middle East at this time. It's written in Greek, and the Mark Gospel, if you read that Gospel, you'll notice that it's very different from the other three in that most of Christ's activities are concerned with exorcisms. Everywhere he goes, he's performing exorcisms because he's driving out demons, and this ability to drive out demons is preparing the way for the apocalypse. He's trying to save as many souls as he can as the fisher of men. Christ is the fisherman who descends down, drops the line, and pulls out men out of the depths of ignorance. They're swimming like these fish in the dark waters of ignorance, and he pulls them out. So he's the great fisherman and also the symbol of the fish. And so we find in the Mark Gospel, which doesn't contain, Spengler says, significantly an infancy narrative like Luke and Matthew do. Luke and Matthew, he says, aren't as authentic as the Mark Gospel. Then he says what happens then, after the apocalyptic literature runs through its course, then it begins to die down long about the 1st century. And we have to remind ourselves that the Gospels start being written about the time of the Romano-Jewish wars when the temple is destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. The Romans destroy the temple, and so it's a significant fact that the Gospels are written down at this point almost as a desperate effort to preserve Christianity, to download the original, as Heiner Muehlmann would call it, the original acute stress of the trauma of the crucifixion, and to download it into media that can become transportable and carried around. And from these media, the latent stress can be extracted through liturgy and ritual, and the original acute stress of the crucifixion can be reactivated. So it's at this point that the writing of the texts make portable, detach from the temple, detach from the Jerusalem itself, which is then wiped out. And Spengler says basically the Roman destruction of Jerusalem freed the Jews. It basically did them a favor because none of the Magian basic consensus communities are geographically bound. The whole idea is to have these diasporic floating consensus communities drifting about through time and space, not geographically bound at all. And of course, as a result of this, the Sadducees, who had been tied with the temple, go down the drain, and the Pharisees, who had not been tied with the temple but later become the rabbis. They lay down the rabbinical tradition of textual exegesis. They come out of this. And so then we get this apocalypse, the writing of the Gospels. And then Spengler says, with the John Gospel, we begin to get something new and very different. With the John Gospel, we have this Greek idea of the Logos. This is part of the pseudomorphosis. This Greek idea of the Logos, there is no infancy narrative. The John Gospel is basically the first Gnostic text. It's the beginning of the kind of mysticism that lays the basis for Gnosticism and what will later be argued about as the substantiality of Christ in the councils of Chalcedon and Ephesus and Nicaea later on. It starts with the John Gospel, and in the John Gospel we have this idea of the incarnation of the Logos. Christ is the Word made flesh, who is simply a God now who wanders over the earth. And then we get the idea, also a new idea in the John Gospel, of Christ not being the final one who transmits the message, but one who announces the coming of a third, the Paraclete, the Comforter. Christ says that I will send another one, a Paraclete, who will come after me, who will finish this message and finish delivering it to you. And so, during this period, Marcion was the man who first began to start putting the Bible together, but he tried to do so by eliminating the Old Testament and all the Jewish texts so that we would just have a New Testament, no Old Testament, and just the epistles and the Gospels. But the church resisted this, and they were forced to take the John Gospel into account. Initially, they were hostile to it, but they were forced to incorporate it into the canon and take it into account. And so we started to get with Montanus. He is the first one to proclaim himself as the Paraclete, the one that Christ had announced as the coming, the one who would come to finish the message. The Montanus came to a bad end. They locked themselves in a church and they were burned to death in a fiery conflagration. So they came to a bad end. But later, as the centuries go by, we come to Mani in 275 AD, and Mani was the one who announced himself as the Paraclete, and Mani really had something to say. We had in that interval between the John Gospel and Mani, of course, the flourishing of all these Gnostic texts, and I think that one of the aspects of Gnosticism is this idea. Normally it's said that since Christ in the Mark Gospel predicted the coming of the end of time, and it didn't happen in that generation, so Gnosticism represented the beginnings of a turning inward. But I think also there was this idea that Christ was this being who had come from another world, but he never described that world. He says to Pontius Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world." He's the being, the light being, the archetypal redeemer from another world, but he doesn't describe the nature of this other world. And I think that the Gnostics then set themselves to working out what the morphology of this upper world of the cosmic spheres, the Magian world cavern, was like. A realm of light with planetary spheres governed by archons, in which Yahweh becomes the secondary deity, the demiurge who creates the world as a mistake, and that gnosis consists in realizing that we are a spark of light fallen to the earth, and that the real deity is in the pleroma, in the beyond Yahweh, who represents the sphere of Saturn, Yaldabaoth, and that the real insight lies beyond him. And that gnosis is the means by way of which attaining illumination into this world of light. I think they were trying to map this out, the world that Christ came from. And in any event, so we get then with Mani has this wonderful narrative where he adapts and combines elements of Christianity, Gnosticism, Zoroastrianism, and there are even Buddhist influences on him, in which he revises the Zoroastrian myth, where in the beginning there is a king of light who creates a world of light, and he sends his son, and here again, here's this mysterious Sao-Chant Redeemer character, the Anthropos. He suits up in an armor of light and descends down to do battle with the demons of darkness, and the demons of darkness tear off his armor of light and they eat it. And this is how light becomes entrapped in matter, through these demons eating it. And he himself fails in his mission, and he becomes captured and fallen in matter, and he has to be rescued. So the Holy Spirit goes down and rescues him. And the Holy Spirit is perceived by the demons as this beautiful woman. And they masturbate, and their ejaculation, the ejaculation falls to the earth, and the semen produces these plants that still have the light particles trapped inside them. The female demons see the Holy Spirit as a beautiful Adonis type figure, and they spontaneously give birth to these monsters. And these monsters come out of their wombs, and they go to these to these plants that contain light in them, and they start chomping them up and eating these plants. So now they've got the light inside them. So we see how light becomes trapped and fallen in denser and denser and denser layers. And so it's fallen. And then eventually what happens is that all the particles of light are gathered up, and they're put together inside the creation of Adam and Eve, who come at the end of this tradition. The fall has already long since happened. They are not themselves the cause of the fall. And this is the vision that Mani has, that he creates. And Augustine himself started as a Manichaean. He started in Carthage, and he was a Manichaean, and he repudiated it. But you can see the influence of Manichaeanism on him in that the Manichaeans had said that it's through semen that these trapped light particles are transmitted through the generations. And also that the primary idea of the Manichaean is, you want to eat fruit. Fruit contains a maximum of the entrapment of light particles. So if you eat the fruit, you're liberating the light particles that are trapped in fruit. And eventually the light particles on a monthly basis drift up to the moon. They fill up the moon like a cup, and then the moon on a monthly basis transmits all of these redeemed souls to the sun. And so this happens on a monthly process. So the whole idea is to create a kind of cosmic machine for liberating the light particles and sending them back up to the heavens where they belong. And so in Manichaeanism, the endeavor is to rescue trapped light particles. But Augustine had said that original sin, not light particles, but original sin is transmitted through the semen. And so this is broken by the fact that Christ's birth is a virgin birth, and because he is born from a virgin, this transmission of original sin is broken with him and stops. And so he's the one thus come, the one who is pure and is not stained with this idea of original sin. So you can see the influence of Manichaeanism on Augustine there. And basically, that's where Spengler brings this chapter up to a conclusion here at this point. I think it's a wonderful vision. He really brings to life the sense of the Magian world as something that is new and fresh and authentic and very different from the classical world and its gods. And he says that the architectural forms, he concludes by saying that the characteristic central idea of the whole thought of the pseudomorphosis is the logos, which after all is a Greek idea. And then he says that in terms of the basic form, architectural form of the pseudomorphosis in the West is the basilica, and the architectural form of it in the East is the mosque, the dome, the world cavern. And so then in the next chapter, it's chapter 8, Problems of the Arabian Culture, letter B, the Magian soul. He goes into more detail about the later phases of this, which we'll look at next.